It always begins the same way. Someone is walking home late at night, the streets mostly empty, the air heavy with silence. There's the familiar rhythm of footsteps on the pavement, steady and calm, until they notice something strange. Another set of footsteps, faint but distinct, echoing just behind them. When they glance over their shoulder, the street looks deserted. No one there, only the flickering glow of a distant streetlight. Yet the sound continues, perfectly in sync with their own steps, sometimes quickening, sometimes pausing, as though something unseen is following. Reports of these so-called shadow people stretch back decades, scattered across cultures and continents. Some describe them as tall, featureless figures darker than the night itself, slipping in and out of sight, never quite solid but always present. Others claim they are more than illusions, that they are conscious, predatory beings, watching, waiting, and sometimes intervening in ways that leave permanent scars on memory. What makes the phenomenon disturbing is not just the stories themselves, but the sheer consistency of details shared by strangers who have never met, all insisting that the figures behave the same way, always at a distance, always silent, and always impossible to explain away. One of the most chilling cases surfaced in Eastern Europe in the early 2000s. A young man in his 20s was walking home from a night shift at a factory. The road was empty, lined with old warehouses and broken lamps. As he approached a corner, he became aware of a shape trailing him, tall, humanoid, and shifting with the shadows of the walls. He said it wasn't like seeing another person. It was like a silhouette detached from anything real. Terrified, he quickened his pace, but the figure matched him, stretching unnaturally, as though the angles of the street bent around it. When he finally sprinted, he claimed the sound of 2 sets of footsteps echoed until he burst through his front door. His neighbors later confirmed they heard frantic pounding on his door that night, but no one ever saw another person in the street. Stories like this are not isolated. In North America, urban explorers often recount similar experiences inside abandoned buildings. They enter an old hospital or factory, flashlights cutting through thick darkness, and almost immediately sense movement in the corners. Shadows appear to dart along walls, slipping just out of sight. One explorer described setting up a camera in a long hallway and leaving it to record while he searched the upper floors. When he reviewed the footage later, his flashlight beam was visible moving in the distance, but in the foreground, 2 dark shapes glided across the hall without any sound. They didn't walk, didn't stumble like a person. They drifted, as though the floor offered no resistance. He never returned to that location again. Psychologists often explain shadow people as tricks of the brain, products of sleep paralysis, exhaustion, or stress. Under low light, the human mind tries to make sense of vague shapes, sometimes inventing figures that aren't really there. But this explanation doesn't satisfy everyone, especially those who've encountered the figures while fully awake and alert. A woman from South America once recounted how she was leaving work at midday, the sun bright above her, when she noticed a long, dark figure moving behind her on the pavement. At first, she thought it was her shadow, until she realized her own outline was cast in the opposite direction. She froze, heart pounding, but when she turned to look directly at it, the shape vanished instantly. To this day, she swears it wasn't her imagination. More unsettling are the accounts of people who feel not only followed, but touched. A college student in the UK once told of walking home from a party when she suddenly felt the air around her grow heavy and cold. The street behind her was empty, yet she swore a presence pressed close against her back. She could hear faint breathing, even though she was alone. She ran, but the sound followed, growing louder, until she collapsed at her doorstep. Neighbors later reported she arrived pale and shaking, unable to explain what had happened except to whisper, "They were right behind me." These stories, frightening as they are, take on an even darker dimension when technology enters the picture. In recent years, surveillance footage has captured unexplained shapes trailing pedestrians. In one case from Asia, a security camera recorded a man walking down a narrow street late at night. For several minutes, nothing unusual appeared, until a vague, elongated shadow emerged from the side of a building and began moving behind him. The man never turned around, seemingly unaware, but the shadow remained just a few steps behind until both vanished out of frame. Analysts examined the video frame by frame, ruling out glitches or camera issues. The footage remains unexplained, fueling debates about what really stalks people in the dark. Shadow people are rarely said to speak, but there are chilling exceptions. A story from Africa describes a traveler walking alone near a rural road after sunset. As he walked, he noticed a second set of footsteps behind him. But when he stopped, the sound also stopped. He turned, seeing nothing but grass and trees, so he called out, asking if someone was there. In response, he heard a voice, low and distorted, echoing from nowhere. "Keep walking." Frozen with terror, he did exactly that, never daring to stop until he reached his village. He later claimed that when he glanced down, he noticed his own shadow moving unnaturally, as though it belonged to something else. Theories about shadow people vary widely. Some paranormal researchers suggest they are interdimensional beings, slipping into our world only briefly, feeding on fear and confusion. Others claim they are spiritual entities, manifestations of restless souls that linger in places of tragedy. A more scientific approach links them to neurological states, hallucinations caused by stress, sleep disorders, or even electromagnetic fields. Yet none of these theories account for the sheer number of consistent reports, stories told by ordinary people who have nothing to gain by fabricating them. Perhaps the most disturbing thought is that shadow people may not simply be observers. Some witnesses insist their encounters escalated over time. At first, they noticed the presence only from a distance. Then the figures came closer, appearing in doorways or standing at the foot of their beds. Finally, some claim the shadows reached out to touch them, leaving burns, bruises, or overwhelming feelings of despair. If these accounts are to be believed, the figures are not just watchers but active participants in human lives, with motives no one fully understands. Encounters with shadow people don't always stop at fleeting glimpses or whispers in the night. In some cases, they escalate into terrifying events that leave victims shaken for the rest of their lives. There are reports of individuals who vanished under mysterious circumstances, with witnesses claiming that shadowy figures were present just before the disappearance. These cases are rare but disturbingly consistent, painting a picture of entities that may not simply stalk their prey, but consume them in ways we cannot understand. One unsettling case comes from a small village in Eastern Europe. Locals spoke about a teenage boy who often complained about being followed home after school. His family dismissed it as paranoia, until one evening he burst into the house pale and trembling, claiming that 3 dark figures had followed him through the woods. He described them as tall and faceless, gliding silently just beyond the trees. Days later, the boy went missing while walking the same route. Search parties combed the woods, but no trace of him was ever found. Some villagers swore they saw shifting shadows in the trees during the search, as though something was watching them. To this day, his disappearance remains unsolved, and his parents maintain that whatever took him wasn't human. In another account from South America, a group of friends walking back from a festival encountered what they described as a wall of darkness. The air grew unnaturally cold, and the sound of music from the town faded abruptly, as though muffled. One friend pointed out a figure standing ahead on the path. At first, they assumed it was just another traveler, but as they drew closer, they realized it wasn't solid. The figure flickered like smoke, expanding and contracting, and then split into 2 identical shapes that circled around the group. Terrified, they huddled together, feeling the figures brush past them with an icy chill. When the shapes finally dissolved into the night, the friends sprinted back to town. Each of them later described the same thing. The figures had no eyes, no features, but they radiated an overwhelming sense of hostility. Shadow people have also been linked to cursed or abandoned locations where tragedies occurred. Paranormal investigators who enter such places often report unusual readings, malfunctioning equipment, and, most importantly, the sensation of being watched. In one abandoned asylum in the United States, a team of investigators recorded several hours of footage. At one point, a shadowy figure appeared on camera, standing at the end of a hallway. It didn't move. It didn't advance. It simply stood there, as though waiting. When the team attempted to approach, the figure dissolved into the wall, leaving behind a cold draft that swept through the corridor. Later, when they reviewed the audio, a faint whisper could be heard under the static, repeating a single word, stay. Not all encounters are tied to specific locations. Some individuals report being followed across cities, countries, even oceans. One businessman claimed that for years he noticed the same shadowy silhouette trailing him. At first, it appeared only in stressful moments, late nights at the office or long walks through dimly lit streets, but soon he began to see it everywhere, even in broad daylight. On a crowded subway platform, he caught sight of a tall figure at the far end, standing perfectly still while everyone else moved around it. At airports, he swore it lingered just beyond the terminal doors. The figure never approached, never spoke, but it never left either. He described the experience as being hunted, not by something alive, but by something eternal. The psychological toll of such experiences cannot be overstated. Victims often describe sleepless nights, paranoia, and the feeling that they are losing their grip on reality. Yet, when multiple people witness the same phenomenon at once, doubts begin to fade. A chilling example occurred in a small American town, where 3 neighbors reported seeing a dark figure standing outside their homes on separate nights. Each described it as unusually tall, with shoulders that sloped unnaturally and arms that hung too long. When one of them finally tried to confront it, shining a flashlight directly at the figure, the beam passed through as though it were smoke. Within seconds, the figure dissolved into the night. For weeks afterward, the neighbors experienced strange disturbances, objects moving on their own, sudden cold spots in their houses, and a persistent feeling of being watched even during the day. More disturbing are the stories of physical harm. While most shadow encounters involve only fear and dread, some victims claim they were touched or attacked. One chilling story from Canada involved a man who woke in the middle of the night to find a dark figure standing in the corner of his bedroom. At first, he thought it was a dream, until he realized he could not move. The figure crept closer, its form shifting with every step until it loomed over him. He reported feeling a crushing weight on his chest, as though something invisible pressed down on him. When the figure finally faded, he was left gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. The next morning, he discovered deep scratches across his chest, as if claws had raked through his skin. Another disturbing account comes from Asia, where a woman described waking to see a shadow standing at her bedside. Unlike others, this figure seemed aware of her consciousness. She said it leaned close to her ear and whispered something she could not fully understand, a language that felt wrong, inhuman. For weeks afterward, she claimed to hear the same whisper echoing in her head, even in public places, like someone standing just behind her. Her health deteriorated rapidly, and she became convinced that the figure had not just followed her, but had left a piece of itself inside her mind. Skeptics argue that these accounts are exaggerations, products of fear, stress, or the power of suggestion. Yet the sheer volume of testimonies, spanning continents and generations, forces us to consider the possibility that shadow people are more than hallucinations. The fact that they consistently behave in the same ways, following, watching, instilling fear, suggests a shared reality. Whether they are interdimensional travelers, spiritual predators, or something beyond human comprehension, one thing is certain: once someone sees them, they are never quite the same again. That's part 2. Darker cases, group encounters, vanishings, and physical harm. Do you want me to keep going into part 3 now, where I'll push the story toward ultimate horror, cases of entire towns reporting them, links to death omens, and theories about why they exist, until we hit your 15K characters target?